Hello, it's Mrs. Duncan, your English 102 online instructor, and today I'm talking to you a little bit about your comparison contrast essay. At this point you have turned in your outline and I have checked it and given you some feedback, and the next assignment is to actually turn that into a draft. Now if you did the outline, you are probably good to go after you've checked, of course, my feedback, because if you did the outline wrong or left something out, then it's going to be wrong in the draft, and until you fix it, you're just going to keep losing points. So the whole idea of checking these early is to catch those mistakes while the points are low, okay? Because the points get bigger each time, right? You turn in an outline and it may be only worth 35 points or maybe 50 at the most, but you turn in a draft, it's 100 assignment points, and when you turn in the final draft, it's 100 essay points. So you always need to turn these things in, but you need to check the feedback and make those changes. Um, Mostly you were filling in the blanks, okay, and you again check on that. The thesis needs to state the two subjects that you have selected, and if you did a story to story comparison on themes, then it needs to restate those. If you picked, like many of you did, some of the protagonists and said this protagonist, and this protagonist, and how they're different or how they're similar, then it needs to say that. You need to say for example, Nora and Hester are different in this way, and this way, or similar in this way and different in these two other ways. Okay, so it has to be a statement like that, just one sentence. Again, look at my feedback. So your first paragraph is going to have this basic information. It will have more of an engaging lead-in. It will make sure a little bit more information is in there, but it will have very basically a clear focus. It will have we'll know which two stories these protagonists come from, or the themes come from, or whatever it is that you selected. And then it will end with this one sentence thesis that states the 3 points that match up with your outline, which is the body. You want to make sure that you draft the same way you structured it here. Okay, this is a particular type of structure, and there are definitely more than one way. There's definitely more than one way to structure a comparison contrast paper. You can do all similarities and all differences, but then you end up with only a 4-paragraph essay, right? We need 5. Plus, that's considered very simplistic and just too much overview and not really analysis. And at the college level, we need to see more analysis. Another way is subject by subject. And again, you do all about Nora, all the points about her, and then all the points about Hester or Mrs. Johnson. And again, you end up with only a 4-paragraph or 4-section paper. And typically, if you go into depth, it's just too much information at one time. So I set up a 3-point outline that has 3 specific selected points of comparison or contrast, or I allowed you a combination, but they need to be important. They need to go beyond the obvious, because none of these are exactly the same, and that's obvious. They're both female. That's obvious. They both have families. That's kind of obvious, but the relationship with their families, that might have a similarity that isn't readily recognized. You kind of want to go for those as much as possible, okay? And so I gave you some feedback on whether I thought maybe your points of comparison were a little too simplistic or obvious, okay? Or that you need to just take it past that obvious and get into something that is more insightful, okay? But when you draft it out, you should be writing that first point of comparison contrast in a topic sentence that says, basically it's the one-sentence version of the one point up here. Nora and Hester differ in how they value their families, or the amount of sacrifice they're willing to give for their families, or something like that, or how they value money, or they differ in the importance that money has, or where the money comes from, and their relationship to it, or something. But it needs to be a sentence, okay, that says the subject's names and then the point of difference or the point of similarity. Then you discuss one at a time. It could be Nora first, it could be Hester first. It doesn't matter as long as you're doing the same one first each time. And many of you did that in the outline, which is good. So let's just say you decide to discuss Nora first. Nora, you talk about Nora and money or whatever. Nora and her family. Nora loves her family. She values them this way. But then, kind of the things are not as obvious because she walks out on them on the end. How can you say she values her family more than Hester when she walks out and abandons them at the end? So you're going to have some discussion there, okay, and some explanation and focused on whatever it is that makes her different or similar to Hester and how Hester, relates to her family. I mean, she doesn't walk out on her family, and yet we would all look and go, wow, she's not exactly the most loving and caring mother. Nora seems to be a loving and caring mother, but would a loving and caring mother walk out on her family? So you have to think a little past these obvious plot lines and look for that deeper issue. Now, this is just a transition. It's not another point. You really only talk about Nora, then you talk about Hester or whoever you've picked, right? Phoenix, Mrs. Johnson. But it's just to make sure you've planned a transition. It's really important in writing a comparison contrast paper is to state these, I would call them the bones of the outline, are really, really important. They can't just be facts. They have to be points of similarity, points of difference, and you have to say them that way. You have to use that language that they're similar or they're different in this particular way. Okay, you've got to state that in the thesis, all three of them together, and then one by one at the start of each body paragraph. Then you transition and you pick depending on whether you're doing differences or similarities. There's a longer list. You'll find that in a handbook with transitions. But similarly, likewise, in addition is weaker, but those are ones that say, hey, these are the same. But then you use the contrast transitions, like on the other hand, however, or those are the ones we typically use in a different way, something that signals that we are shifting to the other subject and the point we're making is that they're different. So that transition is important. That's all it is. It's not a whole sentence. And then you discuss that other person, the other story, and how they specifically differ from or are similar to the subject you've already addressed there. Do the same thing for each individual paragraph. The great thing is when you have two subjects to discuss, there's usually no problem getting your word length. You still need to get your supporting quote, but it needs to be very selective, very specific, needs to be cited. But you have this explanation to do, and I don't need to know the whole story. We've got to get away from just retelling the story and what happened. Those are facts. Analysis points has a specific focus, and it has some thought and some interpretation of it. Things that are not stated verbatim, but you do have reasons, okay? So we had our 4 selections to choose from. Please note that A Dollhouse, because it's a play that has 3 acts of full length, it's much longer, it gets it's punctuated differently. Our short stories get quotation marks every time they're stated in anywhere, an outline, a draft particularly, but A Dollhouse gets italics because it's a 3-act, it's not a short 1-act play, it's a full-length play. Okay, so make note of that as you use those. You've already picked your prompt response, and this is what you observed, so you're not to be using outside sources. If you do that, you're in big trouble. Okay, you should know that by now. It's your own reading, your own observations, it's your own thinking, it's your own interpretation. And I'm just, when you give me the outline, I'm just trying to push that a little bit if you need to go into something a little more in depth. There is a sample, okay, if you haven't written a comparison contrast essay before, hopefully you did in 101. Here's one on literature, and it's a pretty good sample. So it's in our literature book on those page numbers, have instructions and then the sample. So you followed the outline hopefully. If you haven't, you can't draft without having a structure, and you need to follow the structure that was assigned. So if you missed that assignment, you've got to go back in and set up your own structure. You don't get a grade for the outline, you don't get a check on it, but it still has to be done or else you're going to write a draft that's going to have to be totally redone anyway. So save yourself that trouble. There's enough to do after the draft is drafted, and submitted with peer review and so forth. So make sure you have followed that outline I just showed you. And again, remind you the basic paragraph essay structure as it pertains to essay 4. You do want an engaging opener, kind of brings us to your emphasis. You got to give us, these things came from 2 stories, so they have to be mentioned and information about them, and then lead us into the specific with that 1-sentence thesis. Reminder, it doesn't say it here, but reminder again, you have to have text support. And you should use selective quotes, just pieces of things, and you don't have to have them as much for this one. I need specific detail and explanation, but I do expect to see a little bit of cited selective quoting and page references or oh, that's another thing I may mention. This is the first time you're writing about the play. When you write and cite write about and cite a play, you don't use the page numbers, okay? You don't. You could, but that's not very specific. What you do is you cite it by act number and line number, okay? So if it came from Act 1, line 42, okay, if that's who you're referencing there when Nora says something, or Act 2, line 200, when Krogstad says something that you feel like really shows something you're trying to compare there. You do that with plays, okay? You do page numbers with stories, act and line numbers for plays or whatever you're given. Sometimes a longer play has a scene and you use act, scene number, and line number. And then poetry, which we don't really have in this one, you go by the line unless there's other markings like a stanza or something. Okay? So we're not quite done. We have citations. Here's your template again because it's been in an earlier unit, but just so you don't have to go hunt and fish for that again. All you have to substitute, because this is the correct information, is the author's name, the story title, whether it be Worn Path or A Dollhouse. Here, make sure it's correctly punctuated, and the page numbers, okay, for that. But note, this is a 2-story essay. There's going to be 2 citations. If you did Nora and Helmer, well, you wouldn't do Nora and Helmer, Nora and Phoenix. Then you're going to have A Dollhouse here by Henrik Ibsen, and you're going to have Worn Path, by Eudora Welty. You're going to have 2 citations on the works cited page. If you'll go ahead and put those in on your first draft, then I can give you feedback on them. If those are missing, then it just becomes a piece of the draft that's missing, and then I comment on it, said, hey, where's that? And one more thing to kind of deal with. So follow the outline structure. Look at my feedback. If you turned in an outline like you were supposed to, tweak those thesis statements, tweak those topic sentences as I remarked on, dig a little deeper, try to tell us something that comes from you and what you saw, and not just facts about the stories or the protagonists. And you'll be great. It'll be a great job. I'll look at those, of course, after you turn them in on Sunday, give you feedback. You'll be peer reviewing. And that's another thing. I will open up the peer review box. That way, all on the same day, Sunday, you can submit it in, for the assignment drop box for me to look at and give you the assignment grade, but I also will make the next unit's discussion board open so you can go ahead and put it in there so it's available for peer review, right? Because you have to put something in order for it to be peer reviewed. And that, is a small part of the points, but it's the only way it gets a peer review. So I will make that available at the same time. Then you can check back a couple days later when you're ready to do the peer review and check my feedback and so forth. Okay, if you have questions about the feedback I gave you on your outline, ask them right away so that you have that opportunity to get the feedback before that you draft the essay. And I look forward to reading those soon.